Welcome to First Answers. This is episode 9 in the series, A Parent's Guide to Gender Identity. Learn more about what you can do to avoid the errors that can lead to gender-related problems, and learn how to solve the extreme emotions that many consider to be a cause. Visit firstanswers.com to find answers for 21st century parents and more about the podcast.
In this series having to do with gender identity, I've tried to communicate to you that there is a rapid increase in the number of individuals who are believing themselves to have same-sex attraction or to be trans man or trans woman. And while researchers are busy trying to discover where it comes from, to this date it's still inconclusive. The research findings are that trans people, for example, could be that way as a coping mechanism for intense stress or mental emotional difficulty, and they adopted these forms of behavior because it provides a little bit of safety for them. And the other possibility, of course, is that there's some form of pre-birth changes in the hormones that influence the growth of the brain. In any case, I believe that it's a lot healthier for the kids and certainly a lot happier for the parents if their children are healthy and positive and very comfortable in their identities as a male or a female. Now, there are many types of identities and sub-identities that children can learn about and become. We know about that, but I need to say just 2 or 3 things in particular to emphasize that point. A boy, for instance, can be a male and a piano player, a leader or a friend. A girl could be a female and a good friend and an excellent student or a student body president. But of all the different possibilities that exist for our children, sex and gender identities are the central core of each person's personal and social identity. Sex and gender are related to everything else a person does in life. Now think about that just for a moment. We might not think nowadays too much about whether or not we're a female or a male, but most of the time it's on our minds all of the time. Simple things like, I'm going to be in the presence of a man, a woman starts to think about strategies, or vice versa. Are they married or not married? Or what are social expectations for males and females? And so it's time for us to learn how to deal with this in a better way. Just a few years ago, movies had a strict code about what could be shown on screen. Explicit sex was not allowed, of course. Sexual acts outside of a heterosexual orientation were excluded, of course. The internet and social media provide immediate access to large amounts of information about sex and about pornography, showing different types of sexual orientations. Now, in addition to that, what happens is all the pornography and all the other things that are on screen, they don't come close to being able to describe the totality of one's gender identity. They don't come close to the feelings or the emotions or the adjustments you make based on whether or not you're male or female. In recent years, those who have chosen a different form of sexuality have acquired political power designed to eliminate laws prohibiting certain forms of sexual orientation. And they are intensively lobbying, to find greater social acceptance. Now, while everyone deserves understanding and respect for their point of view, the impact and potential impact on our children is largely unknown, except there are a lot of things we do not like, at least on the basis of full appearance. All of this has brought increased attention to sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation. Almost every family has been or will be introduced to circumstances where parents need to know much more. The question is not about if, but when parents need to learn more and, if necessary, to do more, at least more effectively than parents have been used to doing. So my proposal is that it's better to be alert and informed and start early than it is to find out something later where more difficulty exists. There seems to be a large increase in the numbers of children who are confused about their gender identity, as I've mentioned. More parents are reporting that their children have brought home from school tales of conversations about gender from many different types. Recently, a school in our area had a problem with students in the junior high were identifying as animals, and they would bite students, and when students would hit them back, the students that hit them back were told that they had to go home from school. It's all sorts of confusion and difficulty in regard to this. Now, the problem is that even very young children are learning through this informal method of education where there's more sexual openness once appeared necessary to help children learn basic knowledge. There currently seems to be too much of it openly discussed and available. It was not long ago there were only two identities related to sex and gender. Well, that would be a great time, in my opinion. One was male and the other female, and anything else was largely unknown by people, or it was considered deviant. Referring to a person's sex then and now means the sexual characteristics of the baby at birth. The word sex means male or female at birth. Now, unless there are abnormalities of some kind, there are still only two possible meanings of a person's sex. The term gender identity was coined in the middle of the 20th century by John Money, a Johns Hopkins University psychologist. His research led him to believe that during prenatal development, the X and Y chromosomes stimulated the production of chemicals in the brains of developing fetuses. In this way, the brain was masculinized or feminized. For him, this condition still did not determine gender identity, and after birth, gender was a social creation very much like we have described identity formation, that is, freedom and experience and so on. Now, the term sexual orientation was created later. This refers to the types of people one is attracted to and wishes to be with. These three qualities, sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation, help us, as parents, get ready to learn how to be more effectively when working with children. They need to help them develop a stable identity that will last. Now remember, this course uses the word healthy and stable to suggest that a heterosexual orientation is still a parent's desire for their children. But we're now faced with what seems to be an increase in the numbers of children who are identifying as someone other than male or female, that is transgender, and whose sexual orientation is the same as their sex. The National Academy of Science, who published Measuring Sex, Gender Identity, and Sexual Orientation, wrote, "The percentage of the U.S. population that identifies as LGBT is substantially larger among generations, 9.1% of people in 1981 to 1996 to 15.9% of people born after 1997 who identify as LGBT. Overall, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and other gender and sexual minorities are a significant but growing proportion of the U.S. population." Another estimate says that a percent of LGBT people in the U.S. has doubled in the last decade. With these data in mind, it seems to me that it's possible for us to conclude that identity formation appears in an ordinary process in families. It appears to be inadequate for the times in which our children are now living. We would not expect this rapid increase in gender identity issues to be caused solely by genes and genetic makeup. We cannot explain a rapid increase in those identifying as LGBT through gene mutation or a new form of genetic diversity that adapts to the environmental conditions of the time. Nor can we explain it solely by the fact that more children feel confident reporting it. For children now growing up and those individuals who are troubled in any way about their gender identity and sexual orientation, we should try to find an explanation. At least a portion of this growth, probably a significant portion, must therefore be related to experience, interpretations, and validation, which is part of identity formation. And a lot of this takes place in individuals' families. Now, what is lacking for a lot of these individuals would be part of the inner core, the family community, and the larger social community where things happen or situations arise where a healthy set of conditions do not exist for these people or these children. Now, if that's the case, then it's fair to conclude that the process of forming a sexual orientation and gender identity is involved and needs to be revisited, along with what is happening in regard to gender identities. Then, you as parents can see that if you learn different and more effective strategies, then you might be able to create more confidence and assurance that your children will have a healthy sexual or gender identity. Now, since parents have the role of providing experience and helping interpret part of their child's self-knowledge, we could examine what parents are doing and what they could do differently to help their children develop a healthy identity. Well, does this mean that your children are acquiring knowledge about themselves that would not be possible decades ago? And does it mean that this knowledge may lead them to gender alternatives that parents do not want? It's entirely possible. Now, does it mean that whatever is happening to our children may be confusing and create challenges for them when it comes to acquiring and accurately interpreting gender-related experience? It looks that way. Now, I'd like to remind you that there's substantial research that suggests that at least in the transgender situation, this condition may be an attempt to cope with severe mental stress or some forms of mental or emotional disorder. So I point out to you that it will be useful for parents to learn more about the development of gender identity and sexual orientation and see if there are things you can avoid and things you can do to better promote the type of gender identity you wish your children to grow into. So take a look. I'm going to give you a list and take a look and see what you believe about and what you think is going on in regard to your own children. So to begin with, when it comes to identifying practices to avoid, there are three that emerge the most frequently. Here are the three. One is the pervasiveness of disruptive emotions that distract and limits children's self-knowledge about gender. That's a big deal. So a lot of anger needs to be calmed. A lot of malicious or sarcasm or things which distort emotions probably are not useful either. Here's another thing we can avoid. It's called emotional enmeshment. I've talked about that in an earlier episode, but it just simply means that the emotional tie between parents and children is so tight that unless parents are conscious of it and aware of what to do, they can tie their children's emotions to them so tight that there is little freedom or individuality. And when children are in that situation, they don't have the same opportunities to create a positive or healthy identity, and so they are troubled by freedom and by the choices that they're confronted with. The third thing we want to avoid is multiple and rapidly changing messages from social media sources that are so confusing. There is no consistent source that validates gender identities, and that's true. So all three of these are possible for your family. Disruptive emotions, extreme emotions, anxiety, anger, and so on. Emotional enmeshment, which is tying kids too tight emotionally. And then, of course, the multiple and rapidly changing messages from social media sources. So let's suppose that we talk more about each of these. First, there's the emotional disruptors that limit children's gender self-knowledge and their confidence in it. Remember that all forms of gender identity where people are sincerely involved deserve respect and appreciation. So looking for an explanation why there is relatively rapid growth of gender identity problems should not be considered as denigrating it in any way. There is some evidence that girls in particular choose dysphoria, as I've mentioned, in a way of coping with other types of mental and emotional problems. Now, under optimal circumstances, children's brains will collect information about themselves and store it in one of three categories. Now, listen carefully, they're very interesting. One category is the I am, like I am happy, I'm a boy, I am a girl, I am tall, I am a person who runs fast, and so on. The I am category is what they know about themselves. It's often very personal information. Quite a lot of it is never shared with other people except confidants. And so it's called Here's What I Am. There's another category called Me and Myself, and this is all the information about how others see them and treat them and what they believe about other people in reference to themselves. People like me. They don't like me. People think I am conceited. People think I am sweet and nice, and so on. There's that category of information. It's called Me and Myself, and so on. And then there's a third category, which is called Not Me, and that means any information that doesn't apply to themselves. Well, a feminine characteristic like having children is not me. See, and there are other things like engineers who can do complex math. Well, that's not me either. And so we have a category of that. Now imagine what might happen if a child is faced with any emotional condition that motivates them to be wary of, focus extensively on, and cope with threatening external conditions such as threat from other people or people who are angry. Now, when these emotions are present around children, they will need to carefully observe those who are in the source of the threat. They will self-protect and ignore any of their own thoughts in order to avoid mistreatment. It is likely that under these circumstances, children would not be free to safely focus on their own experience and interpret themselves free from undue influence. They will store and interpret less information in the I am category. They will be well acquainted with what they know about others in the me and myself category. But if these are impoverished when it comes to knowing their own thoughts about themselves and their own feelings as separate from others, and typically they will not feel confident to clearly decide something is not me. Not every person fits this exact description, but this system applies to enough individuals to warrant consideration. Now consider the following statements made by people we've interviewed. One man said, "Well, my father was an army officer who was extremely strict and angry when he was disobeyed. I spent a lot of my time worrying about whether I was offending him, and then when I had my first sexual experience with a man, the sex was not great, but lying in his arms was the best feeling I'd ever had at that point in time." This man's sister, whose sexual orientation was toward her same sex, told her side. She described her father as her brother did, but also said, "I never won a game when I played with my father. He played to kill." Now, this might suggest to you that the cause of this problem is the father's behavior. And I'm not proposing that at all. What I'm proposing is that what might happen in this circumstance is the degree of self-protection that the children acquire, and this degree of self-protection makes it difficult for them to be receptive to what the parents are teaching about other forms of gender, and in these cases, a sexual orientation toward the same sex might have been more comfortable for them because of what they experienced at home. Now, another man whose sexual orientation was to the same sex told how he was young, he was quite pudgy. His father occasionally tied a rope around his waist, got on a bike, and ran him around the nearby school several times occasionally to help him lose weight. Now, if that was the father's solution, we might fairly conclude that other areas of his relationship with the son might also be filled with conditions that created anxiety for the son. Now, please note which of the following statements describe what you currently do or have done and areas you may want to improve. Number one, I provide my children with additional education about how they develop and grow, including more knowledge about the body, a child's cognitive characteristics, how they think, a child's emotions and emotional style, positive social skills, and positive moral qualities. If you don't do that, you may want to take a look at that and see the benefit that giving them additional knowledge about their own growth and development can have. Number two, if necessary, I remove my children from any emotional condition that repeatedly threatens them. Think about that. Anytime they are terrified, really terrified, we may want to change them. Now, this does not mean mild levels of anxiety, like starting something new or something like this. This is where there are extreme emotional conditions. Number 3, I help my children learn methods of resolving their anxieties and focus them more on their abilities to generate positive emotions, something you can teach your kids to do. I frequently create a lot of warm, face-to-face communication. Now 5, I make sure to focus on each child's inner world of his thoughts and feelings, and then point out a personality or a gender quality the feelings represent. You have the same feelings as a girl. I've seen a lot of men have those kinds of feelings. Number 6, I treat my children as unique individuals, gender being part of that. 7, I frequently show positive acceptance of my children's bodies, minds, and emotions. You have a great looking body, runs fast and so on. Your mind works really terrific, and you're happy all the time are examples. Now, why do that? Because when you do that and you do it sincerely, it helps your children get information about themselves, which they can categorize and decide, okay, this fits into male or female. Number 8, I create an emotional climate of love, calm, and slowing down the pace of life. I frequently show positive acceptance of my children's bodies, minds, and emotions, along with love, calm, and slowing down. 9, I teach my children the desirable qualities of each sex, male or female, without any prejudice or bias. I recognize and then limit children's exposure to intense anxiety or violence which they witness. I carry out plans, number 11, to promote my children's emotional self-reliance, to be strong, be able to change negative to positive emotions. And number 12, I express confidence in my children and not doubt. I don't say you can't do this, or I don't think you can, unless they really can't. But most of the time I say, I'll bet you can, try it out. So this is the conclusion of this episode. And with it, I would like to say thank you for listening, but also thank you for being interested in the situation that today matters a lot. And it has to do with doing something more effectively that produces healthy, strong identity formation in your children.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the First Answers podcast, which is sponsored by FirstAnswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids, with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Find First Answers on Facebook, and remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the Podcasts app or Google Podcasts, and let us know what you think about First Answers. Check out another podcast by Dr. Scoresby called The Christ Questions, which is centered on questions we ask about Jesus Christ and questions he asks us. Dr. Scoresby examines how Christians can build faith in Jesus Christ that lasts and discover the true blessings and rewards for believing.